Hi everyone, this is Intro GIS at UMass week 7 lecture recording. We didn't have a week 6 lecture recording because we were reviewing for last week's exam. So it's the first time back on the recording for 2 weeks. First thing is that now that we're done with the midterm exam, we are sort of switching to the final set of labs. So you're going to have 3 more labs after this point, labs 5, 6, and 7. And lab 5 is the editor lab. So you're going to be learning about how to edit. And today in lecture, we're talking about sort of where data come from and where a lot of these data sets that you may have seen already or will soon see, when to trust them, when to be a little skeptical of them, and some information about, where they come from. In lab this week, the TAs and I will be bringing exams, so completed exams. So if you want to look at your exam or review any questions that you missed on the exam, you can find me. I'm going to be in Thursday afternoon lab, or you can find the grad TAs on Friday morning and Friday afternoon labs. I want to start before we talk about data more by just putting a flag out there that right after spring break, we're going to start thinking about and working on developing final project ideas. Final projects start to come up pretty fast in the 6 weeks after spring break. So this is just to get you thinking a little bit about final project ideas. In any final project, there are always going to be sort of 3 pieces to it. The proportions, though, could vary. So we could have, any project is always going to have some sort of input data, some sort of analytical component, and some sort of output. The output for you guys is going to be your final project poster. So you're going to have your maps or your data analysis on that poster. Your project's going to include all 3. I would say typically projects focus the bulk of the effort on either input data or on analysis. So for example, if you wanted to focus on input data, then a successful approach to a final project would be to create a new data set. So for example, you could map trails in, a nature reserve. I'm going to give some examples of other data creation projects. And then the analysis of that, if you've put a lot of effort into creating new data, the analysis of that tends to be pretty simple, like, what's the total distance of the different trails that you just mapped at the nature reserve. So here are some examples from past years. Sorry, this is a little fuzzy, of final projects that involve data creation. So this was one where the student took a series of aerial photos of someplace on the Cape, I can't remember exactly where, to look at change in beach and beach erosion between the 1990s and the early 2000s. And so she was able to digitize for each of these years the sort of the sand, which was pretty visible on the aerial photographs, and then compare those over time to look at, like whether and how much the extent of beach had changed. Here's another example of a data creation project. This was a student who's really interested in biking and looking at different bike routes around the Amherst area. And so she had sort of mapped out these different bike routes, and then actually some really nice analyses after that to look at what the slope would be, sort of average, elevation change across these different bike routes, as well as looking at what types of land cover she'd be biking through on these different bike routes. So that one had, both a digitizing as well as an analytical component. Another major focus in past successful final projects has been on the analysis piece. And this is one where typically the data have already been created by someone else. So for example, you download data off of Mass GIS, or you're getting data from one of our existing archives of data sets, which we'll talk more about after spring break, or you're getting it from yourself if you're doing research. And then you take those data and perform a more in-depth analysis of said data. So for example, this was a project that was looking at suitable habitat for blue spotted salamanders in Hampshire County, and was essentially a suitability analysis that included things like distance to roads, locations of vernal pools, and a few other layers that went into this analysis. So all of the data came off of Mass GIS, but there were multiple steps in terms of determining level of suitability for these critters. This is another example one. This was a crowd favorite in that particular year, which was a suitability analysis for where to survive the zombie apocalypse in Massachusetts. So again, one where, and so they were looking largely at distances from roads and distances from hospitals, and a few other layers that went into this analysis. Also one where all of the data layers were downloaded off of Mass GIS, and the analysis was the bulk of the project. So how to find final projects, what to be thinking about, especially over spring break, when hopefully you've got a little bit of mental space to reflect or think about what you might be interested in for this project. I want you to think about those two components. Would you be more interested in creating new data, or would you be more interested in creating a new analysis with existing data? If you're interested in creating new data, then one thing I would want you to think about is, well, what are some natural areas near you? What are some things that you're really interested in mapping? Features on a map, or looking up on the internet to try to find where those things are and getting them on a map. That's something to think about. If you're more interested in the analysis component of things, like a suitability analysis, as an example, I would encourage you to check out the various different data layers that are available on Mass GIS, because those can really help inform what types of information is out there to build your suitability analysis. The second place to look for final projects is we in our data archive have a set of really neat data sets that you could analyze, that past students have analyzed, but it's never gets old. These are really neat data sets to look into, and as long as it's new to you, then it's new to this class. I will be posting in Moodle a link to look through the existing data sets that we have. We have not only existing data sets, but we also have tutorials on sort of getting started with those data sets, and some suggestions for how you might, like what kinds of questions you might ask and how you might approach those. Another option is to add a spatial component to a project that you're doing for another class. So, if you are doing some sort of vulnerability assessment for another class and a spatial component could align with that, that is perfectly reasonable. I love coordinating with other classes. Certainly, if you're a graduate student and you are working on your thesis research, final project absolutely should support your thesis research. And then the other thing to do is just to Google around for spatial data sets and see if anything's interesting out there that you can find. My biggest point here is to try to find data first. So a lot of times, we have in our head like this kind of perfect project that we really want to do, and we can spend a lot of time kind of mapping out this perfect project, but then when you actually go out to look for the data that you would need to do it, you find that, oh, actually I don't have these data sets, instead they're someplace over here. So before you spend lots of time sort of formulating the perfect project, instead see what you can find in terms of data, and then let's create your project related to the data that are available. All right, so that was a brief overview of things to think about in terms of final projects. And yeah, take a look on Moodle for that list of existing data sets and existing suggested final projects, because those, even if you choose not to do one of those are open to everybody. If you choose not to do one of them, you can also maybe get some ideas of directions from them. All right, so bulk of lecture today is talking about data. So you're going to be doing some data creation for, well, not the first time, because you've created some, suitability layers prior to this lab. But this is the first time when you're going to be really digitizing yourself, creating new shapefiles. So we want to talk a little bit about where data come from, whether they're reliable, so that you can eventually, be thinking about those types of things in terms of creating your own data. So here's an example of a suitability analysis. This is in California for this little bird, the California gnatcatcher. And this is something that I actually got off the internet someplace, so I don't know the underlying layers that went into this suitability analysis, but you see these types of things pretty commonly, where you have everything from low suitability to higher suitability for a particular animal or plant or what have you. And so we can start to think about, well, what would be the ideal layers that might go into habitat suitability for California gnatcatcher? And so we might think of things like, well, do we know something about its thermal tolerance? So maybe topography influences this bird's habitat, that it likes higher or lower elevations. Depending on the scale that we were looking at, so this map is relatively small scale, but if it were really large scale, we might think about climate layers as influencing, this bird's habitat, of whether it likes wetter or drier, warmer, colder environments. In this case, it's a gnatcatcher, so maybe we would think about what this bird might eat, right? My guess is that there is not a layer of gnat density in Southern California, but there might be some ways that we can create a proxy for gnat density. So for example, things like, locations where there might be standing bodies of water. So ponds, pools might also be part of that in Southern California. Type of vegetation might be a proxy for, like whether there are gnats present. Type of vegetation also would be a proxy for the habitat of the bird directly, because maybe we know that this bird really likes scrub environments but not forests. So all of that is to say that as far as a key point goes, there are times when you can directly measure whatever it is that you're trying to put into habitat suitability. And there are times when you can't directly measure it, like the distribution of gnats in California, and you'd have to use some proxy to represent gnat distribution, like distance to water or vegetation cover or something like that. And so where do we get that information for, this vegetation cover information? One key place that we look for in terms of vegetation cover are a variety of different land cover maps. I would say some of the most common ones, commonly available at both global scales and national scales, are ones that are classified based on satellites. So essentially, you have satellite data and you're letting a computer algorithm determine this is water, this is forest, this is impervious surface. We can also get land cover maps from aerial photos. So for example, on Mass GIS, the land use land cover layer that's on there is based on people who have digitized looked at aerial photos and said, that's an orchard, that's a cranberry bog, that's somebody's house, and I'm going to delineate the land cover appropriately. So here are some examples of the satellite-based land cover classification. So this is an actual satellite image from Landsat. We're going to be talking more about remote sensing after spring break, but this is a satellite that has been in orbit for more than 20 years at this point. And you can see just visually on here that we've got, some forest cover, we've got some bodies of water in here, and we've got a whole bunch of bright stuff that is bright because in this case, these are paved roads or areas where the forest has been cut down. And so you end up with these sort of brighter features on the landscape. So that type of map, basically that image, has been converted into land cover classification such that, we have, okay, here's, all these roads are classified as barren land. In the land cover classification, we've got areas that are classified as wetlands in this purple down here, the water bodies in the blue, various types of forest in the green, including a differentiation between mixed forest, broadleaf forest, and conifer forest, which is kind of a neat piece of a land cover classification. So all of that is information that could go into your suitability analysis, right? So if you have an animal that loves the forest but will not go near developed land or this sort of barren land, then you could, from this raster grid, we're going to be doing more of this in lab 6, but from this raster grid, you can identify all of those forest land covers and say, those are areas that are highly suitable. These areas that are barren or water, less highly suitable for my critter. The other main way of doing land cover classification is through what's called heads-up digitizing, which is basically where you take an aerial photo and you look at it and you say, all right, I see a vernal pool. I don't see a vernal pool in here, but I see possibilities of a vernal pool or something like that. If you were really well, if you had trained your eye really well, then maybe you too would be able to identify, locations where these vernal pools, these springtime wet areas that that amphibians really like to use in the springtime. So that's how we have a lot of data layers on Mass GIS, is because people who were really trained to recognize these types of features looked through a lot of aerial photos and digitized them, said like, here it is, a likely vernal pool. So this is just some screen capture of some data on Mass GIS, but Mass GIS has locations of certified vernal pools, right? Where somebody looked on an aerial photo, said that looks like a vernal pool, and then they're certified because somebody actually went out in the springtime and verified that indeed there was a vernal pool in that location. And we also have a whole bunch of classifications, land cover classifications of where rare wildlife and rare species are located across the landscape. So not only do we have land cover layers in the sense of, forest versus non-forest types of layers, we also have layers that tell us, rare habitat, less rare habitat, I guess, for various critters. All things that are worth checking out on Mass GIS just to get a sense of what are all of the various different data layers available to you. In addition to heads-up digitizing, so this is sort of another form of heads-up digitizing, but it is one where you don't necessarily see on the map what the feature is. So this is a geologic map, sort of digitized on top of an aerial photograph, where in this case, this is based on field notes of where the edges of these geologic features were located and where some of the fault lines were located and stuff like that, where they actually had, had this on a piece of paper on a map and then digitized it, back onto the image so that they would get a GIS representation of where all of these geologic features are located. One question that comes up well, I would say this question actually doesn't come up as often as it probably should. And that's the question of, okay, I have a map, but how accurate is it actually? So if you get further down the line of doing, scientific research, and you're thinking a lot about using these types of data layers, land cover maps, other forms of maps showing the extents of certain features on the landscape. If you get pretty far down the road of doing research, then wondering or trying to account for uncertainty, and by uncertainty I mean, essentially the accuracy of that map, that becomes more and more important. Some maps have really rigorous accuracy assessments that have been conducted for them. Others don't, have more of sort of assumptions that in one place it worked pretty well, and we're just kind of crossing our fingers that it works relatively well someplace else too. So if we were to do an accuracy assessment of these types of maps, how do we actually go about doing that? The way to do it is to collect some sort of validation data set. And so what do I mean by a validation data set? Well, if the map predicts, so your land cover map says this is forest, then I want to go to this location and I want to look around and I want to say, am I in forest? And if I am in forest, then the map got it right? So that is a correct prediction of the map. But let's say I go out to that same location and I find that I am in the middle of a parking lot, right? So that is a case where the map has over predicted forest and under predicted parking lots. So those are two types of errors. There's an error of over predicting, sort of predicting forest when there's not forest. And there's an error of under predicting, which is predicting something else when it's in fact a parking lot or when it's in fact forest. Typically, the best practice, right, of collecting a validation data set would be to have a whole bunch of random or regularly sampled points sort of distributed across your map. This is not very many points. There's like 20 or something like that here. To really get a good accuracy assessment, there might be hundreds or thousands, depending on the area that you were trying to sample. The challenge with this, though, is that, if purple are our roads, right, and I need to hike all the way in to get to whatever this location is, that could be, I don't know what the distance is, but let's call it a couple of miles, right? So if I need to go and look at 20 points, maybe I can do that in a couple of days. But if I have to look at hundreds or thousands of points, we're talking about really substantive effort. So a lot of times the way that we get around this is, rather than having regular or random samples across our entire landscape, is that we actually stratify them. So stratify basically means I want to get a whole bunch of purple points. I want to get a whole bunch of yellow points. I want to get a whole bunch of light green, a bunch of blue, a bunch of dark green, and a bunch of red. I think that's it for all of the colors represented on here. And I want to do it in such a way that I can actually get to those places, right? So I don't have to hike for like 3 days to go look and see whether this is forest. So a lot of times these stratified samplings are done so that they're, places that are relatively close by to roads, relatively close by to access points, and so that we can hit a bunch of land cover types, as we're going along. So that could reduce the estimate of accuracy of your overall map, because you're missing these like far away locations. So if there's something going on with places close to roads or close to access, that's a trade-off you have in terms of actually fully understanding your map accuracy, access versus comprehensive survey. So those two types of map errors, just so that you've heard of these words in case anyone ever mentions them to you. So there is overestimation error. So that is, you say it's forest when it's actually not forest. The map says it's forest when you go there and it's actually not forest. So that is overestimating the amount of forest. And that is commonly termed commission error, this overestimation. And then the other error is the underestimation error. So this is one where you say it's not forest, but actually it is. So you're looking for forest, you misclassify something as not forest and you miss it. That is omission error. So you're omitting some forest when you should have captured it. Commission is you're adding forest when it shouldn't be there. And both of those two types of errors together, so essentially the average of your omission and your commission errors, gives you your overall map accuracy. So if somebody says a map is 70% accurate, it's a combination of both of these things. There's some overestimation of some land cover classes, and there is some underestimation of other land cover classes. Ideally, all land cover maps should have some form of accuracy assessment associated with them. But sometimes, so for example, with the Mass GIS land use land cover layer, that information is a little iffy in terms of trying to understand, what it is that the accuracy assessment, what exactly accuracy assessment has been performed. So in this case, regional planning agencies reviewed it and we took extensive quality control steps. It doesn't necessarily tell us exactly how to interpret or understand accuracy of this particular map. All right, so those were land cover maps. Second thing I want to talk about are census maps. So the census, those are all coming from mailed, or in this case, these days emailed, so some digital surveys. And census data, so this is just a snapshot of the 2020 census questionnaire, which hopefully you guys saw or participated in. They are collected in what's called census blocks. A block is a certain number of people, essentially. So every block should have about-ish the same number of people in it. Those blocks are then nested within tracts. Tracts are nested within towns. Towns are nested within counties, and counties are nested within states. And then states are nested within the federal, all of the US. From basic census data, you can get counts of people. So numbers of people in those block groups, as the block groups are aggregated into towns, you can see counts of people. You can get change in counts of people over time because they're, the 2010, the 2000 census are also available on the census website. There's also additional demographic data that have been collected for a subset of people. So a small fraction of people who get the census questionnaire also get something called the American Community Survey, or the ACS survey, which has a lot more information about sort of socioeconomic data. So if you're looking for information about more socioeconomic data, the ACS survey may be the place to find it. That requires joining. So back to practicing some joins, joining ACS data back to these numbers that are called FIPS codes, FIPS codes, that would be uniquely associated with each of the census blocks, tracts, towns, counties, or states, depending on the resolution of the data that you're using. So if you plan to use census data, and especially if you plan to use socioeconomic data or are looking for those, get started early, because it is not the most straightforward, simple process to access and get those data into GIS. Here's just a map example of some county level census data of population change. So this is from the base census information at the county, or the county level. population changed from 2010 to 2018. So blue areas are ones that increased, red or peachy areas are ones that decreased over that 8-year time period. Nobody stayed the same because 0 is inclusive in the small increase and the small decrease. You would have to have like absolute 0 change in order to get to be the same on this particular map. Another really nice thing that's available in from the census website are roads. So one of the things that the census has to be able to do in order to mail you one of those census forms is to know your address. And in order to know your address, they need to know all of the roads in the US. So there is, if you Google census tiger, it's called the tiger line shapefile. You can download, this is an old screen capture, it looks nicer these days, but you can download road lines for every county. I'm not sure if you can download it by state. You can definitely download it by county for the entirety of the US. And these are very high resolution roads because they include every single both paved and unpaved roads across the US that have an address associated with them. You can also, another cool way of getting geocoded road information is through Google and the Street View. I'm not sure if you can actually pull information still off of Google Street View, but you can definitely look at it and find the address and get that those address information into GIS. Next thing to talk about in terms of types of data are topographic maps. So this is elevation, right? So topo maps, older topo maps are all based on survey data. So people going out with survey equipment or high precision GPS units to figure out what the elevation is, where they are standing. At the global scale, there is I guess, relatively new radar data for the entire globe, which gives us topographic information. And then for some towns, there is a higher resolution LIDAR, which is the light detection and ranging, which is from an airplane, typically collecting information about topography. If you ever saw a map of a USGS quadrangle topographic lines, those are based on surveys where people have gone out for some number of years and with survey equipment figured out what the elevation was at a certain point. So this includes stuff that predates GPS units. These days has higher precision based on GPS units. Newish, I guess, topographic maps come from SRTM, which is the Shuttle Radar Topography Mission. There's no more shuttle, right? So this is newish, but trying to remember exactly when this was, the early to mid 2000s, there were a series of missions with the shuttle where they actually put this big outboard antenna attached to the shuttle and flew, orbited all around the Earth. And this was a radar sensor. So essentially what radar is doing is it's sending a low frequency pulse to the surface of the Earth. The shuttle was at a known altitude, and then it was measuring how long it took for that pulse to come back. This is speed of light, so it's pretty fast. And based on that difference, they can tell, what the elevation is of the Earth below. And they were able to do this for the entire globe, and you can actually get this at pretty high resolution. So it's a raster grid, and the resolution is something like a 30 meter pixel size, so 30 by 30 meters. So pretty good. Here's an example of the SRTM data for Southern Connecticut and New Jersey and Long Island. And then if you need really high precision topographic data, and not just topographic, but LIDAR is actually used, as you can see in this image. It can measure the height of buildings, it can measure the height of trees. LIDAR is typically from an airplane. This is another form of, imaging, basically same process as the radar, except that it's on an airplane. It's basically shooting a light beam down at the surface and measuring how long it takes for that light beam to come back to the sensor. And because it's airborne, because it's flown on a plane, you get much higher resolution. So on the order of pixel sizes of centimeters rather than meters or tens of meters, the way the SRTM data were collected. Another form of data are change maps. So change maps are essentially asking this could be land cover, how have things changed over time? And typical sources of those, especially if we're looking back in time, are what we need to find are old maps. So those could be digitizing old paper maps. They could be using heads-up digitizing to interpret aerial photos. So here's one example, and this is actually pretty neat really for UMass, because UMass has an old aerial photo collection, a historic aerial photo collection from the mid 1900s for the entire state. And these are paper maps that the library and some students, GIS students, have helped to digitize and georeference. So get into the right location, where does this belong in, Western Massachusetts, Eastern Massachusetts, where exactly are these roads, and lining everything up. So you could go back and say, okay, well, in the 1950s, there was a big swath of forest here, and this was all farmland, based on my visual interpretation of that. And then you can compare that to whatever the land use land cover layers look like today to see, how much agricultural change has there been in a particular town, or how much forest loss have we had over the last 50, 70 years. There are also some pretty cool historic maps. And this is actually an example of someone used these types of maps for a GIS final project some number of years ago, where these are hand-drawn maps of fisheries, basically I forget which fish this is, but fish catch from, the boat was going out and saying, like, here's where we are catching most of the fish of this particular species back whenever this map was collected. And there are a whole bunch of different series of these types of things. And so we've actually had in the past students go in and manually digitize, okay, this is over 200 and this one is 100 to 199, and create this sort of, the tool in GIS is called a fishnet. So basically a grid of polygons, and then assign those attributes to them. It's a pretty fun project. All right, and then a last data set to talk about are point locations. So point locations typically, and you guys are going to be working with point locations in lab because you didn't do the scavenger hunt this year because of snow, but if you had, you would have collected, lat-long locations that you can then pull into GIS. So those lat-long locations could come from data that you collect. They could come from animal collar data. They could come from museum records or herbarium records. These are all things that are available to you. So here's just an example of an animal migration route in Africa of whatever this critter is, and I've forgotten now, and the movement of a couple of them over the season, from early in the season to this was the where there was a lot of water sort of midway through the migration. So if you have collar data for particular animals, and in our archive of data, there are two data sets that have collar data from animals. One is collar data for a bunch of bears that were collected up in Newfoundland. So that's one possible project to look into. And the other one is for a bunch of mountain lions in Southern California. So we have those data available. if looking at collar data, looking at animal movement is appealing to you, those would be good ones to check out. There are also, and I would say GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, is just a really awesome resource online for spatial records that museums have collected. So this contains plant, animal, fungi, all different taxa of species. You can download essentially a table with all of the locations of a species that you're interested in, and find, what we know at least of the global distribution of that species. So this has been a long-standing effort with a whole bunch of different museums, where basically museums, have a bunch of specimens in drawers, right? Whether those are plants or animals or what have you. But those animals were collected in a particular location, and oftentimes that location is written along with the specimen collection. So we know the latitude, longitude, where this, where this bird was caught or where this plant was collected from. And museums have been spending years and years digitizing that information and getting it up so that you can download and use it. That's a cool source. Then this is what you guys are going to be doing in lab, starting lab 5. You're going to be doing more of it in lab 7, I think, which is a spatial display of XY coordinates. So if you have latitude and longitude, so this is a particular species from that GBIF, that Global Biodiversity Information Facility website. If you have latitude and longitude, then you can have GIS through a tool called Display XY, display it on your map in the right locations, and you can turn this display into a point shapefile that you can then map or combine with other data sets, which combine with other data sets is stuff that we're going to do after spring break in lab 7. Great place, this is just a reminder, great place to go to look for data of all of those different, well, almost all, many of those different types that we just talked about are available on MassGIS. So Google MassGIS data layers, you'll get to this page and you can go down the list of all of the great data that MassGIS has created, aggregated, and archived for you. In standardized mass state plane projections, lovely data that you don't have to worry about, working out any kinks with MassGIS data. Great place to start, check out what they've got. So take home points in terms of data, lots of different sources of data, and lots of different places to look for data. Google is a great place to start. We also, for this class, have a list of common data sources that people have found through time, so that I will also be posting on Moodle probably after spring break when we really ramp up final project stuff. If you don't like the array of different data sources that are already out there, you are most welcome for final projects to create your own data by digitizing whatever you are interested in, wherever you are interested in it. One thing though to bear in mind is that all data, so this is true of data that you're creating, it's true of data that you download from somebody else, all data have some sort of error associated with them. So you should not assume that your data are going to be perfect. And if you're doing a more in-depth research project, whether that's an undergraduate thesis, a graduate thesis, then investigating a little bit more so that you understand error in your data sets is very good practice so that you're interpreting them correctly. So this week in lab and on Zoom Lab, we are doing editing. So 2 of the main things, just as a heads up for what you're going to see, are creating point shape files from a table of XY, table of latitude, longitude, locations. And then you will also be doing some heads up digitizing of points, lines, and polygons to create a nice map of the UMass campus. So I look forward to seeing you in lab this week to do more of that.